Both thrust levers were found in the full forward position. Both engines remained attached to the aircraft. Fan blade damage was consistent with rotation at the moment of impact. No evidence of uncontained engine failure with either engine. When the NTSB released their preliminary report on January 30th, 2026, they didn't just document what happened to the Cessna Citation 550 that killed Greg Biffle and 6 others. They demolished the most popular theory about why it crashed. I've spent hours analyzing this data, cross-referencing timestamps, and what I'm about to share with you isn't speculation. It's what the physical evidence actually tells us, and it tells a very different story than most people expected. December 18th, 2025, Statesville Regional Airport, North Carolina. The weather was marginal at best with heavy drizzle, a ceiling around 1,200 feet and visibility deteriorating. The Cessna Citation 550 tail number November 257 Bravo Whiskey sat on the ramp with 7 souls aboard. At the controls was Dennis Dutton, a retired Delta captain with 17,000 flight hours and type ratings that read like an aircraft catalog. The A320, the A330, the Boeing 737, 757, 767, the DC-10. His son Jack occupied the right seat. Greg Biffle sat in the cabin behind them. Engine start began at 9:53 a.m. using onboard battery power. The left engine refused to start on the first attempt, but both engines eventually came online. During taxi, the cockpit voice recorder captured the 3 rated pilots discussing a thrust reverser indicator light that was inoperative. They agreed the reverser itself was working properly, just a bad light. At 10:06 a.m., the Citation began its takeoff roll on runway 10. During the roll, Biffle commented from the cabin that the left engine appeared to be producing more power than the right. He suggested it might be a faulty gauge. Dutton continued the takeoff, planning to remain under visual flight rules until he could activate an instrument clearance once airborne. The aircraft lifted off and entered a left climbing turn. Everything appeared normal for the first few minutes. Jack attempted to contact Atlanta Center 3 times between 10:08 and 10:10 to activate their IFR flight plan, but the controller's workload prevented any response. At approximately 2,200 feet, the aircraft had completed about 180 degrees of turn and began an unexpected descent. At 10:09, and Dennis Dutton and Biffle discussed climbing higher despite being technically required to remain VFR. Dutton initiated the climb. Shortly after, Biffle noted something troubling. The left and right interstage turbine temperature gauges were showing different readings. ITT is one of the most important engine parameters pilots monitor. A split between the 2 engines could indicate a developing problem. But here's where it gets interesting. The NTSB report notes that after Biffle mentioned the ITT discrepancy, there were no further discussions regarding the engine instruments for the remainder of the recording. If an engine were failing, if the pilots were genuinely concerned about power plant problems, we would expect constant references to engine gauges. We would hear power adjustments, emergency procedures. The absence of engine discussion is itself evidence. At 10:02, something more significant happened. The autopilot disengaged either intentionally or independently. 16 seconds later, at 10:18, Dennis Dutton remarked that his altitude indicator wasn't working properly, and then he added that additional left-side flight instruments may not have been working properly either. The Garmin GPS stopped recording airspeed and heading data at approximately the same time. The CVR audio quality began degrading significantly. These events are not coincidental. They form a pattern that any experienced pilot recognizes immediately. This wasn't an engine problem, this was an electrical problem. At around 10:11, something happened that speaks volumes about what Dutton was experiencing. He transferred control of the airplane to his 175-hour son, Jack Dutton, who held only a private pilot certificate with single-engine experience. Jack Dutton, who, according to the NTSB, was not qualified to perform second-in-command duties. Why would a 17,000-hour airline captain hand the controls to an unqualified pilot? Because he needed a troubleshoot. His instruments were failing. The aircraft was at 4,500 feet when the transfer occurred. Dennis Dutton needed his hands free to work the problem, flip switches, check circuit breakers. The right-side instruments appeared to be working. Let Jack fly while he diagnosed the failure. It's a reasonable decision in the moment. It's also evidence that the emergency was electrical, not propulsion. The engine failure theory gained traction immediately after the crash. A twin-engine jet crashes short of the runway. What else could it be? News outlets speculated about engine problems. Social media experts pointed to the initial unsuccessful start of the left engine as evidence of mechanical issues, the perceived power imbalance during takeoff roll, the ITT split. It all seemed to point toward an engine giving up. But the NTSB report contains a single sentence that demolishes this theory. Quote, "There was no evidence of uncontained engine failure with either engine. Unconfined engine failure is the technical term for when an engine comes apart catastrophically. Turbine blades penetrate the nacelle. Debris exits the engine case. It's violent and unmistakable in the wreckage." The investigators found no such evidence. Both engines were examined. Both remained intact. Both were still attached to the aircraft at the point of impact, but the evidence goes further. The examination of the cockpit throttle quadrant found both thrust levers in the full forward position. If an engine had failed, if the crew had experienced an asymmetric thrust situation requiring them to retard power on one engine, the throttle position would reflect that. Full forward on both engines tells us the crew was asking for maximum thrust right up until impact. They weren't managing an engine failure. They were trying to arrest a descent. The thrust reversers provide additional evidence. Both were found in the stowed position. Both reverse throttle levers were in the down position, consistent with being stowed. If the crew had landed and attempted to stop using reverse thrust, the reversers would be deployed. They never made it to the runway. Perhaps most compelling is the fan blade damage. The NTSB found that damage to the engine fan blades was consistent with rotation at the moment of impact. The engines were still turning when the aircraft hit the ground. Aviation experts have been careful to note that the absence of uncontained failure doesn't completely rule out all engine problems. Anthony Brickhouse, an aerospace safety consultant, explained that all uncontained means is that no parts of the engine left the container. It still could have been an engine failure. It just wasn't a catastrophic uncontained engine failure. But consider the full picture. Both engines attached, both thrust levers forward, fan blades rotating at impact, no discussion of engine problems after the initial ITT observation. Meanwhile, the cockpit was experiencing cascading instrument failures. The autopilot disconnected, altitude indicator malfunctioned, left side instruments degraded, GPS stopped recording, CVR audio quality deteriorated. The evidence doesn't point to an engine problem. It points to an electrical system that was systematically failing, taking instruments with it one by one. The engines themselves appear to have been running fine. The crew just couldn't see their instruments well enough to fly an approach in marginal weather. Here's where we can converge on what the evidence actually suggests. At approximately 10:14, something changed. Biffle asked a question from the cabin. "Is the alternator on?" The NTSB report notes that the Cessna Citation 550 doesn't have an alternator. It uses generators. But the intent of the question is clear. Biffle, lined with his 3,500 hours of flight experience, was thinking about electrical power. Dennis Dutton responded that it was the problem. Immediately afterward, the Garmin GPS resumed functioning. Think about what that means. A generator that had been switched off, tripped offline, or otherwise disabled was restored. The instruments came back. They had diagnosed the problem. They had fixed it. The electrical system was recovering, but they were now at low altitude, low airspeed, and deteriorating visibility, lined up for a runway they could finally see. The approach was unstabilized. Time had run out. Dennis Dutton faced an impossible cockpit environment. His instruments had failed progressively, leaving him without reliable altitude indication on his primary display. The weather was marginal, requiring careful reference to instruments that weren't working. His right seat occupant couldn't meaningfully assist because Jack lacked the training and experience to manage a complex emergency in an aircraft type he wasn't qualified to fly. When Dennis handed over the controls, he was effectively flying single pilot in a crew aircraft during an emergency. 17,000 hours of experience couldn't change the fundamental problem. He needed 2 sets of working eyes on 2 sets of working instruments, and he had neither. The workload of troubleshooting, flying, and navigating an approach in IMC conditions would challenge any pilot. Doing it alone without reliable instruments, while trying to restore electrical power, pushed beyond what human performance can reliably deliver. The Cessna Citation 550 requires 2 qualified pilots for a reason. The workload during normal operations is manageable for a single pilot, but when systems start failing, when the weather turns challenging, when emergency procedures are required, the second pilot becomes essential. Dennis Dutton's CE 500 type rating carried a specific limitation. Second in command required. He knew this. He'd flown under this restriction presumably many times. But on December 18th, his qualified second pilot was a son with 175 hours in single-engine airplanes. The regulatory requirement existed because aircraft designers and regulators understood that these situations happen. Instruments fail, weather deteriorates, emergencies occur. The system is designed with redundancy. That redundancy wasn't present on this flight. The investigation will undoubtedly examine why the flight departed with an unqualified crew member in the right seat. Chapter 11, 165 words. The initial engine start difficulty now takes on new meaning. The left engine's refusal to start on the first attempt using battery power suggests the electrical system may have been stressed from the beginning. Batteries have finite capacity. Failed starts consume significant power. If the battery was partially depleted, if the generators weren't properly carrying the load, the stage was set for electrical problems later in flight. The thrust reverser indicator light that didn't work. Another electrical anomaly, dismissed as a simple bulb failure, the perceived power imbalance between engines. Possibly real, possibly a gauge problem. In retrospect, these weren't isolated issues. They were early symptoms of an electrical system that wasn't healthy. The crew accepted each anomaly as a minor discrepancy and continued. Each individual decision was defensible. Collectively, they added up to a departure with an airplane that wasn't ready for the flight ahead. What should pilots take from this tragedy? First, multiple minor discrepancies can indicate a single underlying problem: an engine that won't start easily, an indicator light that's out, instruments that seem inconsistent. Look for the common thread. Second, electrical failures can cascade rapidly and without warning. When the autopilot disconnects unexpectedly, when multiple instruments fail in sequence, think electrical before you think mechanical. Third, the regulations requiring qualified crew members exist precisely for situations like this. What a complex emergency, and IMC isn't the time to discover your right seat pilot can't help. Fourth, an unstabilized approach in marginal weather with recently recovered instruments and a rushed setup demands a go-around. The runway will still be there on the second attempt. You might not be there if you force a bad approach. Greg Biffle spent his retirement doing remarkable things. When Hurricane Helene devastated western North Carolina in 2024, he flew his own helicopter into affected areas to rescue stranded residents. He used his resources and his skills to help people when they needed it most. That's who he was beyond the 19 Cup Series wins and the championship trophies. His wife, Christina, sent a final text to her mother. "We're in trouble, emergency landing." Craig Wadsworth, in the quiet NASCAR everyman who worked alongside Biffle for years, was with them. The Duttons, father and son, were doing what pilots do, trying to save their passengers and themselves. The investigation continues. The final report will take 12 to 18 months. But the preliminary evidence has already answered one question. The engines didn't fail them. The electrical system did. Understanding the difference matters for every pilot who will face a similar situation.